everyone, my name is Dr. Circe Compte. I'm going to be showing you how I go about doing scholarly reviews for the Boston Congress of Public Health Review and other journals. But before I show you that, I did want to share with you what a less successful review looks like. Not to shame the reviewer at all, but really does speak to why we do the fellowship in the first place. So here, just coming in, I've removed the reviewer's name as well as the name of the article with which this is associated. But you can see that this is our template. And at first glance, things seem to be fairly okay. You have the overall rating. You can see it got a rather high rating, 4 out of 5 stars. Comments to the editor, very brief, but still positive, still on target, perhaps, with the idea that probably there's going to be more information below. These comments to the editor are very important because they provide the managing editor as well as leadership for the journal with information about whether or not they should move forward with publication or perhaps ask for revise and resubmit or reject the article. So this is not terribly helpful, but, it can always be redeemed with the content below. Rating scales, again, this matches with the 4 stars. They really seem to appreciate the science and the information being provided in the research piece that was submitted. But where things fall apart, as you can see down here, in response to the open response questions, there is very little information provided. Some of these are barely sentences, and it's not terribly helpful. It's not terribly helpful to the authors, to the editors, to leadership, and it ultimately doesn't really benefit the science. Scholarly review is meant to help place the article, interrogate its position within the literature, particularly in the subject area it is addressing. Is it adding to the literature? What can be improved? It's to help provide direction for the authors in making their revisions, updates, and help them let them know where they're on track and where they need to change their course. Here, nothing is really provided, and just to let you know that this did not go back to the authors in this form. So let's go and look at what I did. I mean, I'm not saying that mine's perfect, but it's a bit better than this. So let's go along for the ride. Hi everyone, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of how I go about doing peer reviews for scholarly articles. I hope you might see a little bit of difference between the one I showed you previously that wasn't as successful compared to this one. So this is for a recent piece that actually was quite successful already out of the gate. It's called Embracing an Environmental Health Approach to Strengthen Frontline Healthcare in Southeast Asia. And as you can see, when you do submit an article, it gets time-stamped. And one of the things that can seem a little unusual is out of the gate, this notes for the editor section. A lot of times this piece gets a bit of a short shrift. However, it's really important for informing the managing editor and also the overarching leadership of the journal about whether or not an article should be considered for publication or ultimately rejected. The first clue to that is the overall rating. It has a 4 out of 5 star rating, which means it might need some minor revisions, but is pretty ready to go in terms of publication. You can see here I've recommended revise and resubmit, primarily because this was a first sort of pass or first review, and we very, very rarely move forward with publication the first go. There's always something that needs to be tweaked before it can be accepted. Then you'll see in the comments to the editor, rather than just say this is great, go ahead and publish it, you want to provide some context for the managing editor and the leadership of the journal. This is because they haven't probably read the article in detail. The managing editor, before they pass along for scholarly review, makes sure that the article satisfies all of the requirements for the journal in terms of, did they use the template? Do they have the citations in the right format? Have they provided their positionality statement and their biographies and so on? Your job as the reviewer is to make sure that, the subject matter, that is correct, that they are using good scholarly research design. Are the methodologies proposed here, are they appropriate? Are they done correctly? Are the conclusions that they are making in terms of the data, is it being reported correctly? What are the implications of the discussion? Are they saying too much about the data or not enough? Is it contributing to the literature? So here you can just see I provide just a brief overview of what's in the article. I make it very clear it's really contributing something very important. It's well done. I recommend revise and resubmit, obviously with very minor to moderate revisions. And then I make just a brief note here about what those revisions entail, because I'm going to provide more information below about them. But here, this provides a thumbnail sketch to the editor about what they're getting into as they move down. One of the things is with these ratings scales, making sure that they make sense. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. I recommended revise and resubmit. You can see here that I agree with these attestations here that this is professionally written, that it had a thorough literature review, and it makes a significant contribution to the literature. If I had done 4 out of 5 stars, said revise and resubmit, and said strongly disagreed to all of this, that would be very strange and wouldn't make a lot of sense, and it just would not make for a very helpful review. The other thing that you want to keep in mind as you're going forward, right here, there's an indication that this is going to be seen by the author. So just keeping in mind that anything you've written, it's going to be seen by the authors. So making sure, even if you find an article to be reprehensible, that you write everything with, in a not necessarily pleasant way, but in a respectful tone, and one that's meant to be constructive. So here, writing about, or answering the question, is the content of this article appropriate for the journal? I don't want to just say, yes, it is. Of course it is. The manuscript is a good fit for the journal. You want to provide an explanation as to why or why not. And I've tried to do that here. How does it align with the mission and vision? It aligns squarely with the public health concerns at the intersections of climate change, environmental determinants, and health system capacity, with a particular focus on Southeast Asia. So right there, the subject matter, how it aligns with equity and social justice, and where is it taking place and the populations being impacted. I provide some additional information as well. I talk about the framing of the manuscript, what they're proposing in terms of interventions and addressing the issues at hand, and then sum it up by saying overall it does fit, and how it can be beneficial to the literature. Even though this is very positive, it's still good to delineate this for the authors, because it's very instructional and really makes it clear that when you do submit to a journal, it's not just enough to make a really good argument or have a really good, strong piece. It has to be appropriate for the journal's mission. This was about strictly emergency health room or emergency department medicine, and talked about best practices in applying bandages. It might be a great piece, but it wouldn't be a good fit for our journal. When one of the pieces we get does not fit with the journal, we provide an explanation there within as well. And in the final section, which talks about ways to strengthen the piece, we'll provide feedback on how to ensure that the piece can be redone or resubmitted at a later date if we're rejecting um, how this piece can be improved or aligned with our mission. The next question is about clarity and coherence of the author's arguments, quality of evidence, balance, and the like. Again, I walk through um, how and why this article does provide clear and coherent arguments, particularly around environmental and climate related data um, within Southeast Asia. I talk about the author's central thesis. I talk about its empirical grounding, because you want to also talk about the data that's used to support, that the authors have used to support their arguments. Um, and then I also close with, how its tone and its scope. And here it was quite balanced, and I discuss why it's balanced. Um, I also sort of foreshadow here some of the constructive criticism that I had in terms of, having an explicit discussion of implementation challenges. Um, they make it clear that they were present, but they could have benefited in this initial iteration from just a few examples of what they were discussing. However, this was really strong, and I wanted them to know that as I finished out this section. This last piece is probably one of the most important pieces of the review, is discussing the implications for research policy and or practice, particularly around, issues of social justice and equity and public health. A lot of times reviewers can sort of, speed through this section, like they do with the editor section. However, we want to make sure that the arguments, the discussions that they make, um, and that the premises that they present to the readers doesn't speak against or over uh, over present the data that they have presented in this article. That they are balanced in their approach. So what I did here was, talked about the methods that the authors used. I also talked about the article from a policy perspective, what they accomplished here, and then talked here about practice. So sometimes I find it easier just to sort of break it down, and it provides a bit of a story about my experience and my takeaways from the piece for the authors. So the better an article is, the easier this process is. However, if you're not able to get those takeaways from it, that's also important as well to discuss. I'm not able to take away anything from a policy perspective, and that's something that perhaps you as the author could address. Same here for practice. I wasn't able to understand the author's approach around practice in their discussion of X, Y, and Z. So um, I don't understand what the ultimate implications were based on the discussion of the data that was presented and their results um, of this article and how it fits into the literature. So this brings us to the final section, and this is kind of a culmination of everything, the sort of conclusion of the story, if you will, the points that an author should take into consideration to strengthen their article. Some people do this in a narrative format. I find it a little easier to do it as bullets, because it allows the author to walk through and kind of gives them a little checklist here of things they can do. Even though there were minor revisions to address, just wanting here to, provide them with as much information as possible to make this as perfect as possible. So here you can see about, and this was insinuated before, about explicitly situating the argument of the health, equity, and climate justice framework. This was sort of intimated, but just making it very, very explicit. Also providing a little bit more context around Southeast Asia, because it is quite heterogeneous region of the world. Very different governments, depending on which country you're in, wanting to discuss around like feasibility and implementation. And also had thought here the piece could benefit from like just a short section on political, financial, and governance constraints related to their arguments. And then, I had this notion around having a couple of concrete examples um, for some of their arguments that they made, providing a little more clarity around the conclusion, tighter framing, and then just some stylistic suggestions. Also, with my reviews, I'll sometimes actually do make these comments or within the document itself, um, but that is not always necessary for these reviews. This is mostly, for folks who are doing academic writing. They know what they need to do to improve a piece. You're with the direction that you're providing here in your review. So this just gives a little highlight. Um, but looking forward to working with you over the next few weeks and seeing how you interpret this approach within your group review. Hi everyone, I just wanted to share with you kind of an instance where I did some copy editing in the document. Basically, the copy edits and the the comments reflected what's uh, in the rubric that's given back to editors. In this case, also wanting to repeat it in the document itself because this was a much newer researcher. This person was in high school. This piece wasn't quite ready for prime time at all when it came in. However, I could see that they had put in a great deal of work. They had a great deal of support from some mentors. Wanted to give this person a bit of a chance just to go through a peer review process. So I thought it might be beneficial for them to do revise and resubmit, but with the caveat that they probably would need to like almost rewrite the paper in many ways. You see that, some of this feedback kind of repeats throughout because I really wanted to point out to the author where this feedback was coming from and what it applied to, noting that some of these copy edits weren't necessarily, things that were typos, but, diction, having things be a bit more scholarly as opposed to more casual or high school, if you will. I also point out, some potentially sort of defamatory language that was used in terms of lifestyle, because since lifestyle means that individuals can have control over their health destiny devoid of any social, cultural, political context, and wanting to sort of challenge them to revisit, how they were framing their arguments and make this a deeper, more meaningful piece. Obviously talking about heart risk or heart cardiovascular covariates, correlates, not something that's really challenging or something that really is groundbreaking for the literature, but could be useful in the context of reviewing what's out now and looking at it through the lens of justice and equity, considering like the current socio-political context, blah, 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 blah. You also note here that I have made sure that any of my comments are not my name, and I did that by coming here. You come over and you basically go to review, go to protect document, and you select this. So when you hit OK and you save your document again, it will remove your name from these pieces here. So, just questions that, you can put this in the rubric that's provided to authors if they're a new investigator even, and they'll know, if you say, please ensure you have permission to reproduce figures, probably they'll understand it. But someone who's in high school or in college, um, or new to graduate school, they may just be a little overwhelmed and be very confused. But here we make it very clear what we're talking about. And then I walk through a lot of the things with the figures and the tables. But I'm happy to say that this person, this student, really took all of the feedback to heart. And let me tell you, there was a lot of feedback. They adopted a new theoretical lens. They basically rewrote this paper. They were able to do enough in order, with a second round of review, which was very unusual for this journal, um, we're able to satisfy our requirements and move forward publication. So it has a really happy ending here.